Zeb, if you're there, it is a different link. I just wanted to let you know I just emailed it to you.
Hey, Zeb, can you hear me?
Yes, Peter.
Okay, so we're still on the same link from the.
We're good where we're at now. That's just for YouTube. It's a different link. I'm sorry. That was the YouTube link is different. That's all. And Zeb will update it. That's all.
All right, I'm here.
Nothing you got to worry about. Thank you. Thanks for asking. Zeb, did you see my email?
I did. Yep.
Okay.
I was waiting for a few more people to join to post it, so it didn't look like all black screens on there.
That's fine. Just want to let you know.
All right. Thanks.
I gave my phone over to Ron for shopping, so we got to make this as quick as possible.
Hey, is he on the Amazon Prime deals? You're
Oh,
gonna
yeah.
be broke when you get done.
Yeah.
Be a lot worse if he was on Cabela's or Gander Mountain or something like that.
No, actually, it's probably worse on Amazon. If he can
Yeah,
buy,
Amazon makes it too easy. Just click, click, and next thing you know, it's at your house.
he just said, so you already have your credit card and everything in here on your phone. I said, that is correct, sir.
My wife's incentive between now and Christmas is to see what she can hit on the Discover card, because if you do Amazon or mail order, you get 5% cash back. Discover card, folks.
All right, it is now 7:30. We'll now call the Bellefontaine City Council to session. Losing my train of thought here. Please rise for the invocation and the pledge. Invocation led by Councilman Kurtz.
We pray for strength and courage to understand each other, cooperate with each other, lead each other, and persevere together. Amen.
Amen.
And
I pledge allegiance
Pledge allegiance
to
to the flag
The flag of the
Of the
United States
United
of
States
America
of America,
and to
and
the
to the
republic,
republic
for which it
which it stands,
one
one
nation,
nation under
under
God,
God,
indivisible,
indivisible, with
with
liberty
liberty
and
and
justice.
justice for all.
Well, we made it through another pledge. That's always interesting. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Mr. Lyle. You're on mute, but that's okay. Mr. Reeser,
Here.
Mr. Springs,
Here,
Mrs. Baker,
Here.
Mr. DeSalma,
Here.
Mrs. James. Here. Mr. Kurtz.
Here.
I have a motion to suspend the reading of the minutes. Motion
Make a
made by
motion.
Mr. Springs, seconded by Mr. Reeser.
Mr. Lyle,
Mick, you're still on mute.
Can you hear me now?
I got you.
Okay.
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs,
yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. DeSalma,
Yes.
Mrs. James.
Yes.
Are there any additions or corrections to the reading of the minutes? Seeing none, we'll move to administrative reports. Mayor's office, Mayor Stoller.
Thank you, Mr. President. A few things to catch council up on. Good evening. First of all, exciting week this week as Bellefontaine goes back to school 5 days a week. And things have been a good start. A little hiccup with the buses, but good start back in all of our buildings. So we applaud them. This evening at 5 p.m., we had another planning commission meeting. We had 2 items on the agenda. One will move forward for council's consideration. It's again one of those alleyways that you couldn't actually get to by the road, but it's behind 3 properties on East Sandusky, and all of those property owners were in agreement. So planning commission will move that in your direction. The other, we had a healthy discussion about an exciting proposal just beyond Whispering Pines in some of the Chaw property that's been really left untouched for years, 49 acres. And so we had a discussion. We didn't move that forward. We tabled that, and we'll discuss that early in November. So stay tuned. But more exciting movement toward new homes in that part of our town. Last week we wrapped up our it was a 1-week United Way presentation. I don't have numbers yet to share with you. And if you'd like, this year it's a little easier. You can actually click a link, and I will send that to City Council. If you'd like to participate with a one-time gift, say you wanted to give $10, or if you would like to participate, we also have some very cool prizes for drawings, and so that would enter you into those drawings. And I know from year to year, some of our members of council choose to contribute a little something back to the United Way. So I will send you that link. We've been meeting quite regularly now with Mr. Brentlinger and David and I, working again through the CARES Act dollars that have reached our community. We kind of talk about them in phase 1, 2, and 3. I'll let Fred dive in when it comes to his report. We are at the end of spending our phase 1 and phase 2. Most of those dollars have been encumbered, and it's gone to pay for a lot of directly related COVID expenses for the city of Bellefontaine. And now we're anticipating there's actually a third wave of money. We haven't seen that number yet from Mr. Reeser. It comes through the county auditors, but we'll see that soon, and we'll get to work on it. It's a blessing in disguise, I'm sure. We're glad to see that we're getting some help from up above. Today we met with the state auditors. They've been working for over the last year, considering what would it look like if we shared services between the sheriff's department and our police department, sharing our 911 services. They might appear, at least on the surface, to be a duplicate service. And to many extents, it does. We're not yet where they can give us their findings, and it's only simply a finding. It would still be up to all those entities, the county commissioners, the sheriff, our chief of police, and certainly your city administration, as to whether we wanted to continue down that road. And of course, that would have to be significant savings to the city of Bellefontaine. If they were there, we'll certainly have that discussion. A couple more items. Later this week, Thursday and Friday, we're entertaining young artists. I may have shared with you in the last meeting, we now have 21 new artist renditions. Most of them are elementary students from Bellefontaine, but our hallways have some new artwork, and it's fun to observe that. Tomorrow, David and I, Chief of Police, Civil Service, will be interviewing 6 candidates to keep our list full, ready for the next police hire. You'll remember we're down 1 officer, and they've been doing a nice job getting it done with 30 rather than the 31 they're budgeted for, so we're grateful for that. The last thing I wanted to tell you is that through the process of an auction, and the dollars went to the discovery riders, I offered that someone could be mayor for a day. It wasn't my idea, but I gladly said yes. Well, the winner is, you'll remember Joe Bader. Joe Bader is a former city prosecutor. His 8-year-old son, Alexander, will be mayor for a day on Thursday. We're going to pick him up in a fire truck. He's going to spend some time with the police department. He's going to go out to the airport. Jenna, we may see you on Thursday, and get to take his first look from up above. His mother said he's not been in a plane before. I'll buy him some lunch. We've got some proclamations and a couple fun things, but and then I'll take him home in a street sweeper. So he's going to he's going to try his hat on as an 8-year-old mayor for a day. That ends my report, unless there are any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Are there any questions for the mayor? I don't see any hands raised, so we'll move to Service Safety Director, Mr. Henry.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good evening, members of council. Just a couple of items this evening. Over the past several months now, I've been reporting fairly regularly about our census status, and this probably will be the last time that I'll bring it up, because that process is coming to an end. but we're still around 70%, 70.2 actually is our percentage for self-reporting. That's about where we were last time. I think maybe a couple of percentage ticks higher than we were in 2010, but would like to obviously get that a little bit higher. So if people would respond to the census request, we would appreciate it. Just so people know where we're at, Ohio's at 70.6% overall, so 0.4% higher than Bellefontaine, and Logan County's at 62.4% as a county for our self-response rate. So we're doing okay as a city, but we could always do better. It's very important that we're all counted, just like the situation we're in now with the pandemic. A lot of those dollars are based on local government funds or are based upon population. So how do they know what that is? You respond to the census and make sure that you're counted so the dollars can come back to Bellefontaine. Visited this morning at Myra Nature Preserve with Chris Myers to view the sky walk, I guess is the description that I would give to it, that's being constructed out there through some grant monies and some other funds. I just would like to let you know that it's progressing very nicely. It's on a steep bank down into a ravine, and the company that's building it poured concrete pillars all the way down this ravine, and then they're building a wood deck with a composite top decking on it all the way down, so that there'll be a viewing area for people who are challenged in a wheelchair or something of that nature. And then there's also a staircase down that people will go from the top of the ravine to the bottom. Myra Nature Preserve is, it's a hidden gem for many of the citizens of Bellefontaine and Logan County. I would highly recommend that anyone visit out there anytime they can. Once this project is completed, it's going to be beautiful, and that is scheduled for December the 8th. But I would say right now we're a little bit ahead of schedule, and hopefully we'll be able to complete that sometime in November. So maybe there'll still be some good weather that people can get out and see it. But I would also say that it's very heavily constructed. I don't think in any of our times here with the city that we'll have to worry about any kind of funds to replace it or refurbish it. It's well built, and it was well planned. So kudos to the Parks and Recreation Department and to the city for adding this to their area out there at Myra. The last two things I guess I would offer. The first is that the paving project is continuing. That's actually scheduled to wrap up on the 19th. We're running about a half a day to a day behind right now, though, so maybe it'll actually end on the 20th. And then following in behind that will be the striping that'll come on at some point, and we'll announce when that's going to begin too, so that people will be aware. Then the very last thing is a small project near the Dairy Queen that you all have been aware of over the last few months is hopefully coming to an end, where we added a turn lane to turn right into the Dairy Queen. But there had been some sidewalk and curbing right there that had collapsed over the last several years from people driving on it and things. We're replacing that, refurbishing the curb so that there's actually an edge there now that people will be able to get over against. And that concrete was poured today. So once that's cured up in a week or two or three, it should be a very nice improvement in that area and make it safer. If there were pedestrians on the sidewalk, there'll be a curb there now so that people won't be able to get over with a car. That ends my report, Mr. President. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Henry. Are there any questions for Mr. Henry? Seeing none, we'll move to Law Director's report. Mr. Stotley.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good evening, Council. You'll see there's some new legislation before you this evening. It was brought to my attention a request on Ordinance 2075. I've spoken with the committee chair for the Rules Committee, Mr. Kurtz, and made him aware of this request. And that is, initially, we were going to locate this new provision regarding points for moving violations under Section 50199. Good timing, I guess. It's better than us having to have approved this already. The judge, with consultation with our city prosecutor, has suggested that we move that provision to a new section 335.99, which will be a penalty section under basically one of the other moving violation sections in our city ordinances. So Mr. Kurtz has those details. I apologize for the last minute audible there, but again, I think it's better to get it now than us to pass something and amend it, a month down the road. Other than that, I have no further report. Be glad to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Stolle. Are there any questions for the law director? Seeing none, we'll move to auditor's report. Mr. Brentlinger.
Thank you, Mr. President. Just to build on what the mayor talked about in CARES, we've been talking about this for 3-4 months, every council meeting. In a meeting today, the county auditor, Jack Reeser, informed us that the county has received the third phase or third wave of payments of CARES money, and will be distributing that to us within the next 4 to 5 business days. His estimated projection on the amount the city is going to receive is between $450,000 and $475,000. The previous 2 payments we received, the deadline for encumbering them is this Thursday, which we're very close. I think we're within a couple $1,000, and we've been holding some things off, expensing that are COVID related, just to see where we were going to be. So there shouldn't be any problem with encumbering all of that. Therefore, we do not have to give any of it back to the county or the state. This new payment that's coming, they have extended that deadline to November 20th to encumber, and we have till December 28th to complete any projects, get everything on site that we're buying, purchasing, or at that point, we have to turn it back to the state. Our plan, our discussions is nothing's going back to the state. That ends my report.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Brentlinger. Are there any questions for Mr. Brentlinger? Seeing none, I will note that Mr. Myers is here. I don't want to put you on the spot, Chris. Did you have any report for Parks and Rec?
Thank you. I appreciate that. I appreciate Dave's report on my area. We're really excited for that project. It's really coming along. So if anybody would like to go out and see it at some point and you want a tour of it, feel free to give me a shout. I'll be happy to meet you out there and we can take a look at it. The other thing we'll be happy to inform you, we are going to do a modified Ring of Lights this year. We're going to be sending flyers out on that here real soon, but on Saturday, October 24th, for preschool and elementary students, we're going to have a drive-through Ring of Lights from 4 to 5:30 at the Logan County Fairgrounds. So we kind of modified it. It's a different kind of safe alternative to trick or treat this year. Instead of an alternative for maybe safety in walking the streets, it's safety from COVID and I guess that contact. So it'll be a drive-through opportunity, and we have several businesses and community groups that are going to be a part of that. So that's the only other thing I had to share. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Myers. That concludes our reports from administration. We'll now move to reports of standing committees. Finance Committee, Mrs. Baker.
Thank you, Mr. President. We have several ordinances for first reading this evening. Ordinance A, we're going to be asking for first and final. And so we'll be asking to waive the 3 reading rule on that. This is a grant from the State Fire Marshal's Marks grant. And because there's no city match to this, so we won't be expending any of the city funds, but this could be for up to $50,000. We don't know how much of that we will get, but we will be able to use that for our users fees for the Marks radios that we currently have. And then if we can purchase additional Marks radios, we'll be doing that as well, depending on how much money we get with that one. So that one is first and final. And then the one, Ordinance 2073 is for the Service Safety Director and the Fire Chief to apply and accept a Logan County Electric Co-op Roundup grant. And this could be up to $2,500. And this is to purchase a portable temporary stream dam that can be used particularly out in the county, that they can drop it into a stream and cause to pools so that they can use that for water for extinguishing fires. No city match on this one as well. So we're also going to be asking for a first and final and to waive the 3 reading rule on that one as well. Ordinance 2074 is supplemental appropriations amending the permanent appropriation ordinance, asking for an additional $26,000 for paint and materials in the traffic lights and signs. This is partly for the fact that we are restriping all of the downtown, and we actually upped to a higher grade of paint that's a thermoplast, I believe is what Mr. Henry described it. It'll last a lot longer, and since we just paved the downtown, it'll be a better color, looks better for our pedestrian crossings. So that's what we need, the additional $26,000. That will be just a first reading only. Then ordinance for second reading this evening, ordinance 2065 is a supplemental appropriation for the general fund computer account. If you remember from last meeting, we talked about this, that this would modernize our system a little bit. $39,955 going for professional technical contract services, $12,620 for equipment, and that would be equipment that's less than $500 on a single item for the smaller items, and then $6,620 for capital equipment, and this will include installation, updating the server, and expanding to a cloud email, and will definitely increase our security. So this one we would also like to move ahead on. We'll ask for second and final on that one. So we will also be asking to waive the 3 reading rule. Ordinance 2066 is the hangar rental fees at the Bellefontaine Regional Airport. And let's see, we'll just be asking for second reading only on that one. And then we have 2 ordinances for adoption this evening. Ordinance 2058 is additional money from the general fund auditor wages and salary line. This is for the payout for Angie Peaks leaving the city last April. That's an additional $18,000. And then ordinance 2059 is the joinder for Logan County to come in with the Bellefontaine Finance and Development Authority and creating a new port authority, which would be called the Bellefontaine Logan County Finance and Development Authority. We'll be asking for adoption on both of those this evening. Thank you, Mr. President. That ends my report.
Thank you, Mrs. Baker. Rules Committee, Mr. Kurtz.
Thank you, Mr. President. Rules Committee has 3 ordinances on the agenda tonight. One of those is for first reading, and it's the ordinance that was referenced by Mr. Stolle. It's an ordinance that supports the municipal court and its ability to assign points for moving violations that are not specifically covered by the Ohio Revised Code. And we'll be asking for passage on first reading only tonight. And I'll also be making a motion to amend the language to have the correct section noted that will be established under. And then we have 2 ordinances for second reading. Each of those pertains to the regulation and permitting of swimming pools. And those will be asking just for passage on second reading only. So that ends my report.
Thank you, Mr. Kurtz. Safety Committee, Mr. Lau.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have no report.
Thank you, Mr. Lau. Utilities Committee, Mr. Springs.
Thank you, Mr. President. We have 2 items tonight. The first one is for first reading only. It's 2076. And that's allowing the service safety director to advertise for bids and then enter into contract for a new refuse and recycling contract starting in late January, the 31st, I believe. And then for second reading is 2068, and that is to connect water to a property at 1304 County Road 10. And that concludes my report.
Is that second reading only on that second ordinance, Mr. Springs?
Yes, second reading only.
Okay, thank you. Streets Committee, Mr. DeSoma.
Thank you, Mr. President. We have one ordinance, 2071, and it's for vacating certain portion of a north-south public alleyway between Columbus Avenue and Court Street in the city of Bellefontaine. And that's all I have to report.
Thank you, Mr. DeSoma. Sidewalks, Curbs, and Parks Committee, Mr. Reeser.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. Myers and Mr. Henry actually covered the majority of what I was going to talk about from our Parks Board meeting last week. The only other addition that I have is that they're going to start looking into hiring the replacement for the Recreation Education Coordinator. There was a big discussion on that, but they're getting ready to post and hire someone to fill that position. Other than that, that ends my report.
Thank you, Mr. Reeser. Audit Committee, Mrs. James.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have no report.
Thank you, Mrs. James. This concludes the reports of standing committees. We'll now move to the portion of our meeting where we welcome communications from citizens. Prior to our meeting today, the clerk notified me that there were no communications from any citizens. Per the standard standing rule of council, any citizens that wish to communicate with council need to submit their written communications to the clerk by 6 p.m. the Sunday before City Council to be reviewed by me prior to reading them into the record. We received no such communications again for this meeting, so this will conclude this portion of the meeting, and we'll now move to our legislative agenda, ordinances for first reading.
An ordinance authorizing and directing the Service Safety Director and Fire Chief to execute any and all documents necessary to apply and accept a State Fire Marshal's Marks Grant and declaring an emergency in the city of Bellefontaine, Ohio.
Mrs. Baker.
Motion to waive the 3 reading rule.
Seconded by Mr. Springs.
Mr. Lyle,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz.
Yes.
Mrs. Baker.
Motion to pass on first and final.
Seconded by Mr. Kurtz.
Mr. Lyle,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz.
Yes.
Mrs. Baker.
Move to adopt.
Seconded by Mr. Springs.
Mr. Lyle,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz.
Yes.
An ordinance authorizing and directing the Service Safety Director and Fire Chief to execute any and all documents necessary to apply and accept a Logan County Electric Cooperative Roundup Grant and declaring an emergency in the city of Bellefontaine, Ohio.
Mrs. Baker.
Motion to waive the 3 reading rule.
Seconded by Mr. Kurtz.
Mr. Lau,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz.
Yes.
Mrs. Baker.
Motion to pass on first and final.
Seconded by Mr. Springs.
Mr. Lau,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz.
Yes.
Mrs. Baker.
Move to adopt.
Seconded by Mr. Kurtz.
Mr. Lau,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz.
Yes.
An ordinance making supplemental appropriations and amending the permanent appropriations ordinance for purposes of paint and materials, traffic lights and signs, and declaring an emergency in the city of Bellefontaine, Ohio.
Mrs. Baker,
Motion to pass on first reading only?
seconded by Mr. Springs.
Mr. Lau,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. DeSoma,
yes,
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz.
Yes.
An ordinance amending section 501.99 of the codified ordinances of the city of Bellefontaine, Ohio regarding penalties for moving violations.
Mr. Kurtz,
I make a motion that we amend this to read, instead of an ordinance amending section 501.99, to read an ordinance authorizing new section 335.99.
and just for clarification purposes, Mr. Kurtz, are you also moving that any prior reference to 501.99 within the ordinance be replaced with 335.99?
Yes.
Okay. And do I have a second for that motion? Seconded by Mr. Reeser.
Mr. Lau,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. DeSoma,
yes,
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz.
Yes.
All right, the ordinance is so amended. Mr. Kurtz,
I move that we pass on first reading only.
seconded by Mr. Lyle.
Mr. Lau,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. DeSoma,
yes,
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz.
Yes.
An ordinance authorizing the Service Safety Director to advertise for bids and enter into contract with the successful bidder for solid waste pickup and recycling services and declaring an emergency in the city of Bellefontaine, Ohio.
Mr. Springs,
Motion to pass on first reading only.
seconded by Mrs. Baker.
Mr. Lyle,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. DeSoma,
yes,
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz.
Yes.
That concludes our ordinances for first reading. We'll now move to ordinances for second reading.
An ordinance making supplemental appropriations and amending the permanent appropriations ordinance for purposes of general fund computer account and declaring an emergency in the city of Bellefontaine, Ohio.
Mrs. Baker,
Motion to waive the 3 reading rule?
seconded by Mr. Springs.
Mr. Lau,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. DeSoma,
yes,
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz.
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Motion to pass on second and final?
seconded by Mr. Springs.
Mr. Lau,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. DeSoma,
yes,
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz.
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Move to adopt?
seconded by Mr. Springs.
Mr. Lau,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs, did I ask you? Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. DeSoma,
yes,
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz.
Yes.
Sorry about that. An ordinance establishing T-hanger rental fees at the Bellefontaine Regional Airport and declaring an emergency in the city of Bellefontaine, Ohio.
Mrs. Baker,
Motion to pass on second reading only?
seconded by Mr. Kurtz.
Mr. Lyle,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. DeSoma,
yes,
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz.
Yes.
An ordinance authorizing the extension of water and sewer utility services outside the corporation line of the city of Bellefontaine to that certain property located at 1304 County Road 10, Lake Township, Logan County, Ohio, and declaring an emergency in the city of Bellefontaine, Ohio.
Mr. Springs,
Motion to pass on second reading only.
Seconded by Mr. Kurtz.
Mr. Lau,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. DeSoma,
yes,
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz.
Yes.
An ordinance amending section 1133.02 of the codified ordinances of the city of Bellefontaine, Ohio regarding swimming pools.
Mr. Kurtz.
Motion to pass on second reading only?
Seconded by Mr. Reeser.
Mr. Lau,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. DeSoma,
yes,
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz.
Yes.
An ordinance amending section 113503 of the codified ordinances of the city of Bellefontaine, Ohio regarding swimming pools.
Mr. Kurtz.
Motion to pass on second reading only?
Seconded by Mr. Reeser.
Mr. Lyle,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. DeSoma,
yes,
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz.
Yes.
An ordinance vacating that certain north-south public alley between East Columbus Avenue and Court Street in the city of Bellefontaine, Lake Township, Logan County, Ohio, and declaring an emergency in said city.
motion to pass on first reading only?
That'd be second reading only, Mr. DeSoma.
Well, according to my agenda, second reading comes with the next one, but I'll go with second reading if that's. Motion to pass on second reading only.
Thank you, Mr. DeSoma. Seconded by Mrs. James.
Mr. Lau,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes,
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz.
Yes.
That concludes our ordinances for second reading. We'll now move to ordinances for third reading.
Ordinance making supplemental appropriations and amending the permanent appropriations ordinance for purposes of general fund auditor and declaring an emergency in the city of Bellefontaine, Ohio.
Mrs. Baker.
Move to adopt.
Seconded by Mr. Springs.
Mr. Lau,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. DeSoma,
yes,
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz.
Yes.
An ordinance providing for the joinder of the County of Logan, Ohio to the Bellefontaine Finance and Development Authority and approving a Port Authority agreement with the County of Logan, Ohio in connection therewith and declaring an emergency.
Mrs. Baker.
Move to adopt.
Seconded by Mr. Kurtz.
Mr. Lyle,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker,
Yes.
Mr. DeSoma,
yes,
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz.
Yes.
That concludes our ordinances for third reading and concludes our legislative agenda this evening. We'll now move to communications from clerk.
None, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Are there any communications from members of council? Seeing none, I'll entertain a motion in a second to adjourn.
I move we adjourn.
Second